Take a look at this painting of Wilhelm IV, Landgraf of Hesse-Kassel, and his wife, Sabine of Württemberg. Portraits like these were meant to display the status of their subjects. Here, we see Wilhelm in his finest clothes, with excessively large pants, showing conspicuous consumption, in a deep black fabric, a color which was difficult and expensive to achieve in this era. He wears heavy gold chains and his hand rests on a gilded sword, drawing the eye to it. Sabine's dress contains even more gold, sporting a pendant with gems and pearls which match her coif. In the background is one of their estates with lavishly decorated gardens. Perhaps surprisingly, we also find several astronomical instruments, a celestial sphere, a quadrant, and other such instruments. This painting was not alone. This work by Holbein of Two Ambassadors also includes astronomical instruments. A painting of St. Augustine by Carpaccio does as well, as does this one by Botticelli. Vasari's painting of 6 Tuscan poets shows them discussing Virgil with astronomical instruments at hand. In these paintings, astronomy isn't just science, it's wealth, it's wisdom, and above all, it's power. These are the characteristics of nobles, of royals. Throughout medieval Europe, rulers desperately wanted to use astronomy as a means to understand and control the world around them. But this power came with great risk, as astrology could just as easily destroy a ruler's power as it could strengthen it. So, in today's video, we'll examine how astronomy was used in the European courts. We'll see how knowledge of the heavens both supported and shaped power and politics in the age of astronomy before the telescope. For much of the medieval period, astrology was not a significant component of the European courts. Indeed, as we've seen in previous videos, astronomy generally struggled to make its way from the remnants of the Greek Empire to Europe. What little astronomy Western Europe did have in the early Middle Ages was practical, used to set calendars, or an extremely diluted and conceptual version of the geocentric model. Astrology didn't completely disappear after the fall of Rome, but for centuries it largely vanished from the Western courts. The art that once advised emperors fell into obscurity. Astrology held on somewhat longer in Eastern Europe, in the Byzantine Empire. However, this was largely through astrologers coming from Alexandria in modern-day Egypt, and when Alexandria fell to the Arabs in 642, astrology largely declined there too. Yet this is also where we begin to see its resurgence. Near the end of the 8th century, the astrologer Stephanus moved from Baghdad to Constantinople. He brought with him a trove of astrological manuscripts, thereby reintroducing astrology back into the Byzantine Empire. In the 9th century, we find Leo the mathematician using these same texts. Things quieted down again until the late 10th century, when astrologers such as Demophilus and Theodosius began compiling various texts on astrology, sparking a revival of interest. By the 11th century, new Greek translations of Arabic astrological texts began to be written, introducing authors such as Mashallah, Al-Kindi, Abu-Mashar, and Akhmat the Persian. This was also when the Centiloquium, an astrological work wrongly attributed to Ptolemy, was first translated into Greek. A century later, a similar revival would happen in Eastern Europe. Beginning in the 12th century, there was a surge in interest in astronomical learning, driven by long-forgotten texts becoming available again, largely through Islamic cities on the Iberian Peninsula, like Toledo. There, Christian scholars were introduced to a variety of texts. From Aristotle, they got works like De Caelo, which became the foundation for the philosophical underpinnings of medieval astronomy. From Ptolemy, they were introduced to his astronomical masterwork, the Almagest, which derived functional models of the heavens. But while the Almagest is almost exclusively a text on mathematical astronomy, Ptolemy had another text on astrology known as the Tetrabiblos, or Quadripartium, which also made its way into Western Europe. On top of this was centuries of commentaries written by Islamic astronomers like Abu Masar, Mashallah, Al-Qabidas, and Haley Ibn Ragel. One of the first examples of this comes from the succession of Emperor John II Komnenos. John was fatally wounded during a hunting accident. He had 4 sons, but on his deathbed proclaimed that the youngest of them, Manuel, should inherit the throne. He justified his unusual decision by stating that there were many predictions and prophecies of the men beloved of God, all which foretold that Manuel should be the emperor of the Romans. John did not specify the precise nature of these signs because he was aware that these things are deemed irrational by the masses, for nothing leads more easily to slander than the stories of dreams and predictions of the future. Thus, we do not truly know if these predictions were astrological. However, astrology appears to have been something of a family tradition among the Komnenoi. John's grandfather, Alexios I Komnenos, was known to keep astrologers in his court. His daughter, Anna, provided a detailed description of some of them. She indicates that an astrologer named Seth accurately predicted the death of Robert Guiscard, and that Alexios consulted other astrologers regarding the appearance of a great comet just before the beginning of the First Crusade. There is less direct evidence about who the astrologers in Manuel's court actually were, but we do know that there were 2 poets who composed astrological poems. Among them was John Kamartos, who would later become Archbishop of Bulgaria. In one of his poems, Introduction to Astronomy, written for the layperson, he gives an explanation of the influences of the heavens on things like civil war, crops, and unsuccessful military ventures, showing that he was well studied in the art. We also know that Manuel had a collection of astrological works that were part of a restricted collection. One of those texts was a copy of Ptolemy's Almagest, which he sent with Henricus Aristippus as a gift to the Sicilian court. See my video on Sicily's Golden Age of Astronomy for more on that. As far as astrological activity, the chronicler Chronates tells us that Manuel relied regularly on astrology. He states that astrologers informed the emperor of auspicious times for his activities and notified him of upcoming planetary alignments. According to Chronates, when Manuel sent a fleet in 1154, led by Constantine Angelos, against Roger II of Sicily, who had attacked Greek cities, the sun had not set before Constantine returned at the emperor's command. For the departure had been ill-timed, and Angelos had set out when there was no favorable configuration of the stars to decree such an action. Or, rather, there was an inaccurate reading of the tables of the astronomical sphere. Similarly, in 1167, he ordered a general to delay a battle for a day because the configurations of the stars was not favorable. The general evidently ignored the emperor's order and attacked anyway, and won. Manuel also evidently planned for disasters foretold by his astrologers when, shortly before his death, astrologers predicted a planetary alignment that they stated would cause violent winds. In preparation, Manuel ordered the fragile glass removed from the imperial buildings and the palace caves stocked for habitation. Perhaps the best indication of Manuel's association with astrology was in response to a letter he was sent by a monk from the Pantocrator monastery, criticizing astrology and calling its practitioners heretics. As Manuel was simultaneously a supporter of the art of astrology and defender of the faith, he could not let such a charge of heresy stand and felt the need to respond personally. His argument was that the stars do not supersede God's power as they do not have an independent volition. Rather, the influence they assert on the earth is that which God imbued them with to utilize them to send signs to humanity. So strong was Manuel's belief in astrology that, even in his final months, he would not accept his failing health because astrologers had promised that he would soon recover and live for another 14 years. In response, Manuel failed to make the preparations for someone to oversee the empire until his heir, Alexios II, came of age. Only in September of 1180 did he realize the severity of his condition, renounced astrology, and appointed his wife, Mary, as regent. Manuel died on September 24th. In his reign, we see one of the ways that astrology and power were connected. Princes would seek the advice of astrologers on when to conduct various important activities. In short, they sought the favor of the heavens. Additionally, we see how they would use astrology to predict important future events. Following his death, the Komnenos dynasty fell into disarray, plagued by infighting amongst the various branches of the family. Ultimately, this dynasty was overthrown by the Fourth Crusade, which began a series of Latin emperors of Constantinople. The Fourth Crusade is a story of a crusade gone sideways. It was originally intended to recapture Jerusalem, but when a member of the remnants of the Komnenos dynasty asked the Crusaders for help in restoring their deposed prince in exchange for support in taking Jerusalem, the Crusaders agreed, successfully sacking the city. But within months, the newly restored ruler would be deposed, and the Crusaders decided to keep the city for themselves. This Latin empire was never particularly stable. The siege of the city had destroyed a good deal of the infrastructure, and the administrative class fled when the city was conquered, making administration difficult. The empire faced a constant threat from the east, but perhaps worse, Venice had helped substantially with the conquest of the city and demanded control over the ports, customs, and portions of the city itself, removing much-needed revenue from the treasury. By the time that Baldwin II was crowned in 1228, the empire was in dire straits, having lost most of its territory and barely hanging on to the city itself. Baldwin was so desperate for income that he mortgaged the crown of thorns, supposedly the very one that Christ wore, to France to pay his debts. Baldwin spent much of his reign traveling across Europe begging for support. Although his reign was uncommonly long, he could hardly be viewed as particularly successful. And it's here that we find an astrological text written about Baldwin. But there's something suspicious about these predictions it contains. They're far too specific and far too accurate. For example, they predicted his well-known travels to the papal and French courts to seek funding, his marriage to a member of the Spanish royal house, and his mortgage of some of his sons to Venetian merchants to help pay some of his debts. Historians therefore conclude that these predictions were written after the fact. However, this helps them date the text by finding the time that the supposed predictions stopped being accurate. Based on this, historians believe that the text was written in the second half of 1259 or the first half of 1260. The text is interesting because it serves as a subtle piece of astrological propaganda, framing Baldwin as the last world emperor. This referred to a Christian legend that had been circulating since the 7th century and came from a text known as the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius. It posited that a Christian king would defeat the enemies of Christendom, ushering in an age of peace on earth, and then travel to Mount Golgotha to relinquish his crown, turning the kingdom over to God. This would fulfill the prophecy from Daniel and usher in the final conflict between good and evil, the Apocalypse. In this text, the poverty of Baldwin's kingdom is presented not as a failure of the king, but as divinely ordained through the stars, tying it to versions of the legend in which the last emperor would be impoverished. It states that the possessions of the empire will be destroyed by the spear of Mars. Through fierce battles that will arise in which his friends do not help him, poverty will be upon him as a result. In doing this, the text is suggesting that Baldwin's survival against such odds is nothing short of a miracle itself. It also suggests that Baldwin's day of victory, in which he would rejoice and trample his enemies underfoot, would be near at hand. Thus, in Baldwin's reign, we see a new use for astrology, political propaganda. However, the authors of the text failed to divine that Constantinople would fall to Nicaea in 1261. Baldwin escaped and lived in exile for the remainder of his life. Turning our attention back to Western Europe, one of the early texts that was translated from Arabic into Latin was done for the Portuguese queen around 1120 by John of Seville. This was the Secreta Secretorum and claimed to be a letter from Aristotle to his student Alexander the Great, advising him on leadership. Modern historians seriously doubt its authenticity, but in the medieval period, it was taken at face value and extremely popular, with several copies known to have been in various royal libraries. This includes a beautifully illuminated copy given to Edward III by Walter of Milmet. The Secreta Secretorum told kings that they should do nothing without consulting some wise man that knows the constellations and the course of the planets, for he may know diseases that are to come, and wars, pestilences, famine, and other accidental things. Thus, you may know these things which are good to know by this art and the course of the planets. And, if you can find no other remedy, it is good to know that you may pray to God for his remedy. Similarly, we see astrology being recommended to Robert, the Earl of Leicester, around 1140, wherein Raymond of Marseille dedicated a work to him informing him that astrologers study the system of movements and conjunctions of the fixed stars and planets, by which it is possible to know not only the present, but the past and future. As with the Eastern region, we find many examples of astrology being present in the courts of various royals. On the Iberian Peninsula, we find two successive kings of Aragon who were patrons of astronomy, Peter IV and John I. One of the earliest astrologers Peter patronized was Dalmau Sesplaines. In 1359, Peter commissioned him to work with Pierre Gilbert to provide Peter with all of their joint astrological works without delay. Peter continued to patronize Sesplaines, requesting a celestial sphere in 1362, made from gold, precious stones, and expensive pigments. As late as 1381, Peter requested that Sesplaine write a great and solemn work of astrology. He also had a new set of astronomical tables created, which were translated into Hebrew, Latin, and Catalan. In 1376, Peter sent his daughter a small clockwork device which chimed the hours and had a miniature astrolabe on it. With a father so interested in astronomy, it's not surprising that Peter's son, John I, also became a patron. In 1371, Prince John requested that his father's physician, Bartholomew de Tresbens, send him all of his works for study, as astrology was regularly used in medicine to predict the course of a disease and determine the best times to administer care or prepare remedies. John also requested an astrolabe and books on astronomy from a Muslim doctor, Yusuf Avernardu. Astronomical works were also commissioned from the Jewish astronomer Vidal Afrahim, who evidently was slow to deliver, as John wrote to the governor of Majorca to prohibit Afrahim from leaving until delivery was made. John also became brother-in-law to Jean, Duc de Berry, when he married Yolande de Bar. John and Jean often wrote to each other on the subject of astronomy, lending each other books and apparently even their astrologers. In 1388, John requested that the Parisian astrologer Guillaume Lunel be sent to Aragon. After John became king, he wrote to his vassals to inform them that he had taken the Jewish astrologer Cresques de Vivers as his official astrologer and demanded that they show him the proper respect. But while both Peter and John showed strong interest in astronomy, the reaction from their subjects was notably different. The reason had to do with the situation of Aragon in the 14th century. At that time, the Iberian Peninsula was a loose confederation of semi-independent states. The rulers often vied for territory, and thus a king was expected to be a military leader who avoided frivolous activities. Peter was a successful military leader, and thus his interest in astronomy was overlooked. In contrast, John was seen as a weak ruler. For generations, Aragon had been attempting to conquer the island of Sardinia. Prior to John's reign, they had nearly succeeded. However, during John's reign, nearly all of Sardinia was lost. Similarly, John lost all of his land in the duchies of Athens and Neopatras, both in Greece. And in 1391, their territory in Sicily revolted, declaring Louis II of Naples as their new king. Following John's death, his brother, Martin of Aragon, succeeded him, as John had died without an heir. In an effort to clean up what was seen as mismanagement by John, Martin initially dismissed all of John's counselors. Among them was Bernat Metge, the personal scribe to the former king and queen. In an effort to regain his position, he blamed John's failings as a king on his interest in astrology, claiming it crossed the line into heresy. In this way, John's interest in astronomy failed to be a source of power. Instead, it became a source for his opponents to attack his character. Turning to the English courts, we also find some interest in astronomy there. Among the books in the library of Richard II is an astrological work known as the Liber Judicorum, which Richard had requested according to the introduction. However, there is little other evidence to suggest that Richard paid too much heed to astrologers. By the reign of Henry VI, astrology seems to have become more commonplace in the English courts. From this era, we find a collection of 6 horoscopes for Henry's birth, many of which vary in substantial ways. On top of these, there is an elaborate treatise weighing the validity of some of them. Why do we find such a sudden interest in Henry's astrological fate? The answer has to do with a supposed conspiracy which began in July of 1441 when Eleanor Cobham, the Duchess of Gloucester, conspired with two clerks, Roger Bolingbroke and Thomas Southwell, to bring about the death of Henry. The charge seems to be rather overstated. At a minimum, Eleanor was in line to inherit the throne through her husband, Humphrey of Lancaster, should Henry die without an heir. To determine whether this should happen, she turned to Southwell and Bolingbroke to astrologically determine when this might happen. The pair predicted that Henry would die of illness in July or August of 1441. Word of this prediction reached the ears of the king, who was greatly troubled by such predictions. He set his astrologers to check it, and they were unable to confirm it. The trio was then charged with treason and attempting to use necromancy to bring about the king's death. Eleanor fled to sanctuary before she could be arrested, but Southwell and Bolingbroke were not so quick. Southwell died in the Tower of London. Bolingbroke was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Eleanor, being subject to only ecclesiastical jurisdiction while in sanctuary, was only forced to do public penance in London, divorced from her husband, and sentenced to house arrest in a royal castle, but with a stipend of 100 marks a year. One would think that this unfortunate incident would have indicated that casting royal horoscopes without authorization was a risky proposition. But in 1477, we have another case, this time of Thomas Burdett, who hired two clerks from Oxford, John Stacey and Thomas Blake, to cast nativities for the king and his eldest son, Edward the Prince of Wales, in 1474, to know when the king might die. Stacey and Burdett were executed as a result, while Blake was able to secure a pardon through the intervention of James Goldwell, the Bishop of Norwich. These cases show how deeply astrology weighed on the minds of kings. While astrology could be used as a political tool, it could also be used to predict outcomes that could cast doubt on the stability or longevity of a reign. To prevent this, the precise time of births was often kept secret to prevent astrologers from being able to cast an accurate horoscope. Overall, kings were reluctant to allow astrologers too much free rein, as it could be contrary to the good order of a kingdom. I covered another example of this in my video examining a mass panic caused by astrologers predicting catastrophic floods in 1524. The role of astrology in the royal courts continued to grow in the late 15th century, particularly with several Holy Roman emperors within the Habsburg dynasty, as well as in some of the Italian courts. Beginning with the Habsburgs, Maximilian I was an emperor with a keen sense of his own legacy. Even before he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, he was already considering how he would be perceived by history. To that end, he began dictating his autobiography around 1499, and even in the early drafts, astrological themes were included, appealing to his natal horoscope to justify his triumphs. To him, astrology wasn't merely a useful tool. Being wise in this heavenly science was a characteristic of a good ruler. We do know that his father, Emperor Frederick III, asked the astronomer Regiomontanus to cast a horoscope in 1452 to determine the suitability of his bride-to-be, Eleanor. When the pair was married and Maximilian was born, they again asked Regiomontanus to cast a horoscope for his birth. However, when retelling this story for his autobiography, Maximilian had his biographer, Joseph Grunpeck, himself an astrologer, embellish it. The new version claimed that his parents had prognosticators of all sorts attend the birth, but that Frederick was so dissatisfied with their vague predictions that he judged astrology to be the only one that was true and accurate. In his main autobiography, Weiskönig, Frederick was so wise and learned in astrology that he cast the horoscope himself. This work even claimed that a comet was seen shortly before his birth, which shone all the more brightly at the moment of his birth and faded quickly thereafter. This is an interesting twist, given that the usual connotation of comets is as killers of kings. The Weiskönig also discusses sources a prince can look to for political influence. Among them, he listed astrology as a diplomatic tool. His reasoning was that while diplomacy was needed, it often failed due to people not being honest about their motivations. To help pierce the veil of their obfuscation, Maximilian believed he could use astrology. And here we begin seeing a new way that royals would attempt to use astrology, as a form of direct intelligence gathering. Another revealing work that allows us to understand how Maximilian viewed astrology is Theurdank, which is a retelling of Maximilian's journey to marry Mary of Burgundy in 1477, fictionalized and romanticized in the style of an epic poem. But perhaps as a bit of humility, Maximilian did not specifically name himself as the protagonist, but replaced himself with Theurdank, who is accompanied by his faithful companion Arnhold, easily identified in the numerous woodcut illustrations that accompany the text via his heraldry of a wheel of fortune. Here, Arnhold is the personification of Maximilian's reliance on astrology, with the wheel of fortune simultaneously representing the changes of fortune astrology can bring, as well as the course of the planets. Throughout the text, Arnhold is not an active participant in the quest, but merely warns the prince when forces conspired against him or were in his favor. He helps Theurdank overcome the foes of Forwitig, Unfallo, and Needleheart, personifications of excessive passion, the dangers of chance, and envy, respectively. Maximilian also kept several astronomers in his court. Many of these astronomers published texts for public consumption, such as Practica, booklets with broad astrological predictions for the coming year. Reading their predictions, we can see that they are apt to paint a particularly rosy picture for their ruler. These Practica, as well as other astrologically infused works meant for public consumption, like wall calendars, helped support Maximilian's agenda. For example, one of Maximilian's chief concerns was securing continued support from the German princes in his wars against the Turks. To assist him with this, Sebastian Brandt authored astrological predictions, making it clear that the stars foretold his victories and that, if they did not support him, they would risk ruin and destruction. In 1492, Maximilian was in Alsace, preparing an offensive against the French when a meteorite fell in Onsisheim, sufficiently close to Maximilian's position that he made a detour to see it. He then ordered that it should be preserved at a local church and suspended by a chain. Brandt used this heavenly sign to predict that Maximilian would be successful against the French, which he was. We also find various instrument designers and makers in the service of Maximilian. Johann Stabius designed a horoscopion, a type of universal sundial. In the dedicatory letter, Stabius stated that the instrument was linked to Maximilian's effort to build cohesion throughout the empire, likely an effort to standardize timekeeping. In response to the patronage, the astronomers would regularly add imperial symbols, such as the double-headed eagle, into the engravings around the Practica, calendars, and instruments, explicitly tying astronomical knowledge to Maximilian. As previously mentioned, this is because Maximilian considered being learned in this art to be a princely characteristic. By setting this as the standard and then exemplifying it, Maximilian was able to use his knowledge and patronage of astronomy as a way to bolster his own prestige. Maximilian had successfully converted the liability that being associated with astrology could bring to a source of power. To be clear, Maximilian was not the first to use knowledge of astronomy as a source of pride. Rather, he was simply the most successful. In Hungary, we find the king, Matthias Corvinus, presiding over an astrological duel between the astronomer Martin Bajlica and Jan Sturzer, in which both would attempt to rectify the geniture of a horoscope. In short, this meant that they would retroactively determine the precise time of a birth using astrological techniques. By declaring himself capable of judging such competition, Corvinus asserted his own knowledge and mastery of the subject as superior to even the practitioners, even though the final decision apparently came down to the fact that Bajlica impressed Corvinus by using an astrolabe as part of his calculations. Although Corvinus used astronomy as a source of prestige, he did not weave it into his identity as a ruler so completely as the Habsburgs. For them, being connected to the cosmos became something of a Habsburg signature, which was eagerly continued by Ferdinand I, for whom the Turks continued to be a growing threat. Again, we find astrologers declaring that Ferdinand's success against them was destined. Andreas Perlach used his ephemerides to support Ferdinand. He declared that the solar eclipse of 1530 meant suffering for the Turks, and that it would free Vienna from their threat in short order. When Ferdinand was subsequently successful in some of his military campaigns, Perlach framed it in an astrological context, writing, "Ferdinand has the aforementioned planet Mars in his horoscope, and in the very place the star under which the Matmut sect invaded, a fact that I indeed would consider like a miracle, another misfortune for the Turks. Ferdinand continued the tradition of patronage and wielded it as a political tool so successfully that by 1562, Andreas Schoner noted that the Protestant princes were working on their own astronomical skills to mimic the Habsburgs. Astronomy as a source of royal prestige had evidently taken hold. But Ferdinand also expanded the practice in a particular way. While the previous rulers had astronomical instruments and other curiosities gifted to them, Ferdinand decided to display them in the first Habsburg Kunstkammer, a cabinet of curiosities. In this, Ferdinand began the tradition of collecting all worldly knowledge, elevating the projected level of prestige even further, as visitors to the court could now be led through this museum. This was a tradition that Ferdinand's successor, Rudolf II, would maintain. When he moved his royal court from Vienna to Prague, he dedicated a substantial portion of his palace to the collection. The entrance was ornamented with images of the 4 elements and the 12 months, presided over by Jupiter. The Kunstkammer was divided into 3 wings: Naturalia, focused on natural history, zoology, botany, and mineralogy; Artificialia, showcasing coins, prints, and other examples of supreme craftsmanship; and Scientifica, including scientific instruments, clocks, and celestial globes. Not only did the collection include items gifted to Rudolf, but he frequently made commissions for pieces to add to his collection. For example, we find this stunning celestial globe, complete with a clockwork mechanism to move it. The collection held over 60 mechanical clocks, many of which did more than simply tell time. Some included astrological displays or the number of days since the last full moon. Rudolf became renowned as a patron, so much so that in 1586, John Dee even left the employment of Elizabeth I to go to Prague in hopes of patronage there. However, Rudolf was apparently too generous. He often had trouble paying the commitments that he made, and while Rudolf was known as a great patron, it did not stop him from being viewed as an ineffectual ruler. In response, his brother Matthias attempted to persuade Rudolf to step down. In 1611, Matthias's agents requested that Johannes Kepler, who was serving as imperial astronomer to Rudolf, create a false horoscope predicting Rudolf's fall. They believed that, if such a prediction came from the great Kepler, that Rudolf would be sure to accept it as legitimate and step aside without violence. Kepler rejected the offer and informed the emperor's advisors, stating, "I am of the opinion that astrology has to be withdrawn not only from the Senate, but also from the heads of those who would want to advise the emperor today to the best of their abilities. One must keep astrology entirely from the emperor's mind." In this video, I've largely tried to focus on ways that astronomy was directly interacting with power. Doing so was a difficult task, as so much of the astronomy surrounding positions of power don't interact with it in a clear and direct sense. While we frequently know that astronomical texts were in the collections of various royal libraries, we don't know that the royals actually read them. Just because an astrolabe was gifted to a king doesn't mean he used it. Just because someone cast a horoscope about a king doesn't mean that the royal knew about it, or if they did, that they acted on it. Only rarely can we directly link astronomical knowledge to political action. In most cases, this is because of a lack of source material. But in one instance, we have a trove of astrologically related materials that show more than just a passing interest in astrology. Rather, the Dukes of Milan in the Sforza dynasty were regularly obsessed with it, and, in their story, we find many of the previous threads weaving together with a royal power struggle mixed with murder and the loss of their state. The first in the Sforza lineage to prominently use astrology was Galeazzo Maria Sforza. By all accounts, he was not kind to astrologers who issued prognostications that displeased him. According to Bernardino Corio, a near-contemporary chronicler, Galeazzo was cruel to the point that, when the Duke asked a priest how long he would reign, he answers that he would not reach the 11th year, and for this reason, he put him in jail, sent him a small piece of bread, a glass of wine, and a wing of capon, and let him know he would not receive anything else. The man survived on these things, even eating his own excrement, for 12 days. Then he died. However, astrologers that pleased him could expect regular requests. Galeazzo did not seem to provide direct patronage to his astrologers. Instead, he would extend other political favors for them, such as securing them positions at the University of Pavia, as he did for Francesco Medici da Busto and Gabriele Pirovano. He could also grant land, which he did for Ambrogio Veresi da Rosate. He also helped the son of Raphael Vermercati find a position on the royal staff. Galeazzo was a careful consumer who did not rely on the advice of a single astrologer. Instead, he would regularly order his secretary, Ciccio Simonetta, to request prognostications from multiple astrologers without informing them that others had been asked. If I were to classify how Galeazzo used astrology, I would say that he attempted to use it for astrological intelligence, to determine how the world around him would unfold, and to control that information so that he alone could benefit from it. In 1469, he wrote to Antonio de Trezzo, his ambassador in Naples, insisting that he press the King of Naples to forbid anyone from naming him in their annual prognostications. In another case, he wrote to Sacramento de Rimini, his ambassador, stating, "You know how serious things become when some evil opinion spreads among the populace about some looming calamity, as it is often done by daring and vain astrologers who, in divining freely about occult things which are known only to God, unwisely predict the death of princes, wars, and famine, and they even come to identify unambiguously the person who should meet such a terrible fate. Serious and honest people pay little attention to this type of prognostication. The populace, however, listens to them and waits in suspense, often giving rise to ideas that create chaos in those states and principalities. It is our opinion that His Holiness, the Pope, should excommunicate all those astrologers and mathematicians who will have the presumption in their prognostications to name or specify a prince or lord, either by making explicit or implicit mention of him, but that it is allowed to them only to express universal predictions, because the particular ones can throw up chaos and are dangerous, and the religion and Catholic faith forbid this type of superstition." Yet, while Galeazzo tried to forbid others from openly prognosticating on the affairs of state, he certainly had no compunction about doing so himself. Indeed, in 1475, he asked Annius of Viberto whether his longtime enemy, King Ferrante of Naples, would die from his illness. Annius stated that he would, although Ferrante went on to live another 19 years. We also know that Giovanni Simonetta, Ciccio's brother, wrote a letter to Gerardo Caruti, the Milanese ambassador in Bologna, asking Ceruti to determine the opinion of Bolognese astrologers on what was happening in Milan. Specifically, he asked him to shrewdly find out from those astrologers from whom you sent this year's prognostications if they could foresee anything specific about Galeazzo in their prognostication, and similarly, in their judgments, they could perceive something about Galeazzo and our state. He also requested that Ceruti ensure that if astrologers must write about Milan or its leaders, that they say only positive things. When an astrologer from Ferrara, Pietrobuono Avogario, wrote a practica that suggested the state of Milan was in danger, Galeazzo asked Giovanni Battista to speak to Ercole d'Este, the Duke of Modena and Ferrara, and to admonish Avogario to never write again. If Ercole did not, or Avogario did not comply, Galeazzo would have his astrologers spread rumors about Ercole. If that didn't put an end to things, Galeazzo would show his displeasure more tangibly. And indications are that Galeazzo followed through on that, as we also have a letter from Lorenzo Belletto, addressed directly to Avogario, warning him of Galeazzo's reaction and mentioning the threat directly, stating, "You predict and cast Utica about other people, but you cannot foresee or prognosticate your own imminent dangers. The Duke of Milan has sent there a man to have you cut into pieces, and he is sending another man right now, so that if one fails, the other will do it. So that you know I am telling the truth, if you check the entries to the city, you will find that a certain Giorgio Albanese, a man of short build and with a dark complexion, will come that way. The other is a Giovanni de Luccoli, a larger, ruddy man with long chestnut hair who has a limp. Be careful, as I speak with reason." And this was not the only instance in which Galeazzo attempted to quash rumors. When predictions foretelling Galeazzo's imminent death were spread in Bologna by Girolamo Manfredi and Marsilio da Bologna, Galeazzo again asked Giovanni Battista to go to Bologna and speak with the rulers to ensure the astrologers stopped publishing. He warned, "If they do otherwise, we will show them our displeasure about their prognostications and they will regret it." Giovanni il Bentivoglio wrote back to Galeazzo, reassuring him, and Battista wrote similarly shortly thereafter. And they were evidently successful, as Marsilio de Bologna wrote a contrite letter to Galeazzo, apologizing for the misunderstanding, and commented on the passages within his prognostications, and attached a geniture for Galeazzo, which painted a new and gloriously rosy prediction for Galeazzo and his family. However, he still warned him of danger just after his 42nd birthday. As much as Galeazzo tried to control this information, it seems he could not escape the fate that the astrologers had predicted for him. Galeazzo was assassinated on the 26th of December, 1476, in the Basilica di Santo Stefano Maggiore. According to Corio, Galeazzo had a previous attempt on his life and was on guard. In response, he had taken to wearing a corazzina, a protective garment, but removed it before attending the Mass because it made him look fat. After the death of Galeazzo, his son, Gian Galeazzo Maria, was set to inherit the throne, but was only 8 years old, too young to rule. Quickly, Galeazzo's brothers conspired to take the throne, but Galeazzo's widow, Bona of Savoy, fought them off and banished them. However, she foolishly allowed them to return in 1479. They quickly forced Bona aside, and Galeazzo's brother Ludovico assumed stewardship of Milan. Even as Gian came of age, he was too sickly to rule, allowing Ludovico to continue to lead. However, many were suspicious that Gian wasn't truly sick and that he was slowly being poisoned by Ludovico. The evidence is not clear on whether or not this was the case. Letters were regularly sent to Ludovico from the countryside residence at which Gian rested, providing Ludovico a constant update on his nephew's status. They paint a picture of a youth who ignored all of his doctor's advice, eating and drinking to excess. However, medieval medicine was regularly worse than the illness, wherein Gian's doctors regularly prescribed purgatives, weakening him further. On the other hand, Ludovico sent his most trusted astrologer, Ambrogio Veresi de Rosate, to assist just days before a sudden downturn in Gian's health, leading to the suspicion that it was Veresi who administered the poison. In Gian's final hours, his doctors, Gabriele Pirovano and Niccolo Cusano, wrote to Ludovico, indicating that they feared for him, especially because of the terrible influence of the heavens, both because of the eclipse and the direction of his nativity. Suspiciously, Ludovico publicly claimed that he believed his nephew's disease had been light and curable, in direct contradiction to the reports he had continually received. Regardless of how Gian died, the day after his death, Ludovico declared himself Duke of Milan. And more than any other ruler we've examined, he adopted the advice of the Secretus Secretorum, advising rulers to take no actions without consulting an astrologer. Unlike Galeazzo, Ludovico relied on Veresi almost exclusively and exhaustively. The dates of weddings were planned to be astrologically fortuitous. This ended up backfiring when it demanded a pair of weddings occur in close conjunction. Ludovico's own wedding to Beatrice d'Este was on the 18th of January 1492 in Pavia, followed only a few days later by the wedding of Galeazzo's second daughter, Anna Maria Sforza, to Alfonso d'Este in Milan. Ludovico was forced to rush to Anna's wedding in inclement weather. When Ludovico's first child was born, Veresi was involved in determining the levatura di parto, the time when a woman was allowed to leave her bed after giving birth. This was an important moment as it signified when the woman was no longer considered to be in danger of dying from childbirth and could begin resuming her duties as a wife. Later, Veresi predicted that Beatrice would again become pregnant and bear Ludovico a second male child. Ludovico set so much stock in the prediction that he invited Beatrice's mother, Eleonora of Aragon, to the birth. When Ludovico crowned himself duke, the precise moment was determined astrologically. When joining an alliance to expel Charles VIII from Italy, Ludovico waited until the moment decreed by Veresi, in which Taurus was in the ascendant. He relied on astrologers to determine when Charles's army would enter Naples and who would win the ensuing battle. He was told that the battle would happen on the 18th of February and that Alfonso of Aragon would win. Instead, Charles did not enter until late February and was quickly victorious. Alfonso abdicated and his son fled. And Ludovico relied on Veresi to determine the dates of his own battles, when he attacked the French army in June of 1495 and for the Battle of Fornovo in July. Although Charles won the battle, the mounting coalition against him forced him to withdraw to France, where Ludovico attempted to keep tabs on him astrologically. Following Charles's death, his heir, Louis XII, also invaded Italy to pursue his claim on Naples. Due to relations with the aforementioned Maximilian I, Ludovico expected his assistance, but when it didn't arrive, he again turned to Verisi to determine when Maximilian might send support. However, we find an interesting response when Ludovico's ambassador, Augusto Semenzi, shared Verisi's forecast with Maximilian. Maximilian, the emperor who sought to build himself up as wise in the celestial arts, laughed and said he had little faith in astrologers. Ultimately, Ludovico would come to regret his reliance on astrologers as well. When the French pressed in on Milan, Verisi told him that the stars were aligned behind the French in August, but come September, Ludovico would be victorious. However, he barely lasted until September. By then, most of his allies deserted him, and there was virtually no one left to defend the city. Ludovico fled on the 2nd of September. Verisi fled as well, but was captured by Isabella of Aragon, who accused him of poisoning Gian on Ludovico's behalf. Ludovico would make an ill-fated attempt to recapture Milan in 1500, but was also captured. He was taken to the castle of Lax in the Loire Valley, where he was imprisoned until his death in 1508. In tracing these episodes across various courts, a consistent pattern emerges. Astronomy and astrology were rarely neutral bodies of knowledge. Instead, they became instruments through which rulers sought to understand, legitimize, and sometimes control the political world around them. At times, this relationship was practical, such as when emperors consulted astrologers for auspicious moments to act, hoping that favorable celestial configurations might ensure success in war or marriage. In other cases, astrology functioned rhetorically, shaping narratives about a ruler's destiny as seen in the propaganda surrounding Baldwin II, or the carefully cultivated cosmic imagery of the Habsburg emperors. Yet, the same celestial language that could elevate a ruler's prestige could also threaten it. The prediction of a king's death, unfavorable prognostications, or rumors grounded in astrological speculation had the potential to destabilize regimes by undermining confidence in a ruler's future. For this reason, monarchs frequently attempted to regulate or suppress such predictions, even when privately seeking the insights of astrologers for themselves. The cases from England and Milan illustrate this tension particularly clearly. Rulers simultaneously depended on astrological counsel, yet feared its public consequences. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, astronomy had become deeply embedded in the symbolic culture of the European courts. Instruments, books, and practitioners of the celestial arts were displayed alongside other markers of princely learning and authority. Knowledge of the heavens thus became part of the performance of rulership, reinforcing the image of a prince as both wise and cosmically ordained. Nevertheless, the stories examined here also reveal the limits of that power. Astrological predictions were often wrong, and rulers who relied too heavily on the stars could find themselves misled. Ultimately, the relationship between astronomy and power in the medieval and early modern courts was not simply one of belief in celestial influence. Rather, it was a complex cultural exchange in which astronomical knowledge, political ambition, propaganda, and personal anxiety all intersected. The heavens offered rulers a language through which to frame destiny, authority, and legitimacy, but they could never fully control where the stars might lead. Hi everyone, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to those that have donated to this channel, either here on YouTube or even better, through my Patreon. If you're interested in the history of astronomy, I recommend you join the Patreon. Not just because it supports this channel, but because it's where I post the really detailed information. To make this video, I ended up reading 6 entire books on astronomy in various royal courts, plus a handful of papers. By joining the Patreon, not only do you get access to the script for this video, complete with portions I ended up editing out, but you get the full list of citations and my complete set of notes. And for videos like this one, that's a lot. This script was about 13.5 pages. The notes and list of citations is an additional 67 pages. If that's more than you're wanting, thanks for watching anyway, and I hope you come back for more astronomy before the telescope.